What if history's most powerful men weren't quite the men we thought they were? Behind the crowns and portraits, beneath the medals and myths, lies a secret history of silk, scandal, and subtext. These were kings who wrote love letters to other men, princes who preferred lace to lineage, royals who ruled empires while hiding lives they could never name. This isn't just a list. It's a whispered confession from the past. Welcome to 25 British royals who were secretly born female, a story too strange for fiction and too well documented to ignore. Before we dive in, if you love dark history, royal secrets, and stories that rewrite everything you learned in school, hit subscribe. It helps more than you think. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We want to know who's staying up late with us, and who's just waking up to the weird. 1. King James I to James VI of Scotland. There are love letters. There are coded poems. And then there's King James I writing to a man with lines like, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." James wasn't just a king. He was a 17th century emotional arsonist with a throne and a pen, setting fire to every known boundary of royal masculinity. His favorite, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, didn't merely hold court favor. He held James's hand, sometimes publicly, sometimes politically, always intimately. James referred to himself as the husband, and to Villiers as his wife. A joke, perhaps, if repeated once. But James repeated it. In letters, in speeches, in the eyes of a court that didn't know whether to laugh, whisper, or plot. Of course, courtiers wrote it off as eccentricity. Kings are allowed those. But when James elevated Villiers to the peerage, showered him with gifts, and then lived with him in near constant companionship, even the stiffest Whig in Parliament arched an eyebrow. The rumors didn't begin in adulthood. As a young man, James had already formed passionate attachments to male courtiers like Esme Stuart, whose sudden promotion and lavish treatment caused a full-blown political crisis in Scotland. James cried when Stuart was exiled. Not metaphorically, he wept. In front of the court. Historians still argue about what it all means. Some call it platonic, others call it political. James called it love. And in a time when desire could get you beheaded, or worse, remembered, he hid it in plain view, behind veiled language and velvet robes. Because in James's world, the line between king and queen was less about gender, and more about who got to wear the crown. And that brings us to a king who wore it with the cold distance of a man surrounded only by other men, and no one quite knew why. 2. King William III. William III didn't trust women. Not politically, not socially, and definitely not domestically. He preferred the company of men, always had. His court was stacked with Dutch advisors, male confidants, and hand-picked favorites who were curiously young, curiously devoted, and curiously close. Hans Willem Bentinck, Arnold Joost van Keppel. Their names show up in the royal correspondence like fingerprints at a locked-room crime scene, persistent, obvious, and unexplained. It didn't help that William's marriage to Mary II was formal. The two ruled together, yes, but their dynamic felt more like a constitutional merger than a romance. She died quietly. He didn't remarry. Instead, Keppel moved into his household. William gave him titles, land, power, a little too much of all three. Jacobite propagandists, hardly impartial but always creative, accused William of sodomy, of surrounding himself with unnatural men, of building a private court within a public one. But court gossip has a special kind of endurance when it echoes what everyone already sees. Keppel rode in the royal coach. Keppel shared the king's quarters on campaign. William gave him the titles of Viscount, Earl, and finally Duke before the boy was 25. That's not just favoritism. That's narrative structure. Of course, defenders say it was political convenience. He needed allies. He needed loyalty. He needed someone who looked suspiciously like a royal consort but wasn't. But William's avoidance of traditional displays of heterosexual power, no mistresses, no flirtations, no heirs, left a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped a series of elegant, whisper-generating young men. Even his enemies called him cold. Maybe he was. But cold doesn't mean empty. Cold means controlled. And sometimes the tightest control is hiding something burning right beneath the surface. And speaking of fires that burned far too hot to hide, let's talk about the king whose love nearly brought down the crown. If you're already 2 royals deep and still listening, you're exactly our kind of people. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't yet, so you don't miss the rest of this beautifully strange descent into royal ambiguity. And while we're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you procrastinating sleep, or starting your morning with monarchy and mild scandal? We see you. 3. King Edward II. Every royal court has its whispers. Edward II's didn't whisper, they shouted. Piers Gaveston was more than a companion, more than a friend, and far more than just a political favorite. He was Edward's obsession. The kind of obsession that makes bishops furious and barons homicidal. When Edward ascended the throne in 1307, his first act wasn't strategic or ceremonial. It was bringing Gaveston back from exile and showering him with titles, land, and a theatrical level of attention. Contemporaries noted their affection, their shared banquets, their matching clothes. It wasn't just the gifts, it was the intimacy. Edward ignored the nobles, ignored his wife, and doted on Gaveston like a teenage prince in a romance novella. Court chroniclers couldn't decide what was worse, the scandal or the sentimentality. Gaveston was eventually executed by nobles who decided they'd had enough. Edward's grief was public and relentless, but he didn't learn discretion, he just replaced the man. Enter Hugh Despencer the Younger, another nobleman who quickly became Edward's emotional crutch and political liability. Their relationship sparked civil war, quite literally. To some, Edward was a weak king, to others a foolish romantic. But to anyone paying attention, he was a man who couldn't stop falling in love with the wrong person at exactly the wrong time, twice. Even his brutal deposition was wrapped in emotional irony, betrayed by his wife, imprisoned, and erased. But no regime change could scrub the records clean. The letters, the favoritism, the fury. It was all there in the parchment. Edward wasn't just scandalous, he was transparent, and that may have been his most subversive act. But if Edward was emotionally reckless, the next king was emotionally encrypted, forever tangled in alliances, penance, and a very strange bedfellow. 4. King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. The thing about Lionhearts is they usually roar. Richard I, however, murmured, especially when it came to his personal life. The man was a battlefield legend, crusader, tactician, hero of national myth. But for all the masculine bluster of his military resume, his domestic life was oddly barren. He was married once, briefly, never saw his wife again, never produced an heir, never even pretended to care. What he did care about was Philip II of France. The two shared a bed, according to chroniclers. They also shared campaigns, letters, tears, and a diplomatic breakdown that looked suspiciously like a breakup. Contemporary sources describe their bond in poetic and intimate language. They loved each other so much it was marvelous to see. That's not battlefield strategy. That's sonnet territory. And when Richard did confess his sins before the church, it wasn't for war crimes. It was for sins of the flesh. The record doesn't say which flesh, but it doesn't have to. The speculation has outlived the certainty. Richard's reign was mostly spent abroad, rarely in England, rarely at court. He governed like a man with no interest in domestic order or domesticated appearances. His knights, his favorites, his inner circle, all men, always. He built an empire of testosterone and 5. King Richard II. Richard II didn't rule, he adorned. His reign was a theatrical performance of velvet, verse, and very pointed patronage. If power is usually expressed through conquest, Richard preferred pageantry. Art, culture, extravagance, and behind it all, a circle of unusually beautiful young men who rose too fast, fell too hard, and stayed too close. Foremost among them was Robert de Vere, the Duke of Ireland, a title Richard invented just for him. De Vere wasn't simply favored. He was elevated, protected, and mourned with a grief that made Parliament uncomfortable. When Robert was exiled for treason, Richard kept his memory alive like a widow in denial. He built monuments. He commissioned poetry. He sent gifts across borders, the kind of behavior usually reserved for saints or lovers. Chroniclers couldn't decide if it was love or lunacy. They described Richard's court as effeminate, indulgent, even corrupt. But that may say more about what they feared than what they saw. Because Richard, in many ways, was gender non-conforming by royal standards. He wore elaborate garments, preferred artistic company, and responded to insults with icy elegance rather than brute force. To the medieval mind, this was dangerous. A king who didn't perform masculinity was a king who couldn't rule, or so they claimed. He was eventually deposed, of course, replaced by a cult. 6. King Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII was the king who quit for love. That's the story anyway, but the real mystery might lie somewhere behind the tuxedos, the polished shoes, and the whispered conversations behind Mayfair curtains. Because before Wallace Simpson there were other rumors about his friendships, about his time in military service, about the thin line he walked between charm and something less explainable. He was known in his youth for being emotionally intense with other men, officers, school friends, socialites, the kind of friendships that lingered too long in letters and left too many people wondering. He danced with them, vacationed with them, and never married until scandal made it necessary. Historians note his effeminate manner, his fashion obsession, his discomfort with traditional masculine roles. He was always surrounded by men, confidants, aides, companions, and yet somehow always alone. His behavior raised eyebrows even within his own family, who preferred their monarch stiff and scandal-free. Edward was neither. Was he bisexual? Was he lonely? Was he simply allergic to the kind of power that came with heterosexual appearances? It's hard to say. The man who gave up the throne for a woman might have once lived in a world where he couldn't claim a man, even if he wanted to. And maybe that's why his entire reign feels like a costume party, one where no one was quite sure who he was playing, not even himself. 7. Prince George, Duke of Kent, son of George V. If Edward VIII was mystery wrapped in elegance, Prince George was chaos dressed in charm. The Duke of Kent lived like a man allergic to stillness, always in motion, always in the company of people who didn't quite belong at royal banquets. Actors, artists, musicians, socialites, lovers, and at the center of it all, a cloud of rumors that refused to dissipate. George was the royal family's most glamorous liability. Handsome, theatrical, and impossibly well-connected, he exuded a kind of fluid magnetism that seemed more at home in cabarets than courtrooms. Biographers have noted his affairs with women and men, but it's his supposed relationship with playwright Noel Coward that continues to cast the longest shadow. Some say they were just friends. Others say they were mirror reflections, witty, flamboyant, and very aware of how the world saw them. The Duke's inner circle was glittering but unconventional, his habits excessive, and his behavior, by royal standards, dangerously uncontained. He was said to drift between identities as easily as he drifted between lovers. Was it rebellion? A search for self? Or just a refusal to play the role carved out for him by birthright? His death in a plane crash only added fuel to the speculation. A tragic ending, yes, but also a convenient one, in the way that early deaths so often are for stories that lack closure. The royal family mourned him, but quietly, as if unsure what to say about a man they'd never quite figured out. 8. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale, later King of Hanover. In the shadowed corridors of Georgian politics, few figures managed to draw as much quiet discomfort as Prince Ernest Augustus, not because he said too much, but because he didn't fit. He was stiff where others were boisterous, cold where others were theatrical, and above all, he was off. Effeminate, some whispered. Odd, others said. But the word that kept circulating was simply unnatural. Contemporaries noted his mannerisms with vague but pointed commentary. Too soft-spoken, too concerned with personal appearance, too dependent on his male attendants. While none of these traits were crimes, in the ultra-coded language of royal masculinity, they were enough to raise suspicions, especially in a prince so high in the line of succession. There were no open scandals, no named lovers, no definitive paper trail, just court gossip that swirled and lingered about private habits, unusual attachments, and a household that operated more like a quiet salon than a dynastic machine. His rise to the throne of Hanover provided an exit from British scrutiny, but not from speculation. Ernest Augustus didn't help his own case. He avoided public warmth, eschewed traditional family displays, and kept his personal life tightly locked behind propriety. But sometimes what's most carefully concealed. 9. Prince Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, son of James I. Prince Henry Frederick was born into the golden glow of expectation, heir to James I, darling of the Jacobean court, and England's great hope for a more masculine monarchy. But despite the political optimism, Henry was gentle, not weak, not unaccomplished, but soft in a way that didn't quite match the crown-shaped silhouette carved out for him. Contemporaries described him as graceful, sensitive, and refined. He preferred art and poetry to jousts and hunts. He lavished attention on his male companions, young courtiers, poets, attendants, with a kind of emotional clarity that made the court fidget. He was close, perhaps too close to several of them, though names rarely made it to the official record. What did remain was the tone, affectionate letters, emotional dependence, and moments of intense private loyalty that raised the temperature in rooms supposedly governed by protocol. He died young, just 18, from what doctors claimed was typhoid. The nation mourned a prince lost before his time, but the legacy he left behind was more curious than tragic. A royal youth so idealized in public that no one dared examine his private life too closely. Had he lived, would the contradictions have unraveled him? Or would he have become the king who subtly rewrote masculinity for the monarchy? We'll never know, but his memory remains suspended between myth and murmur, an heir to the throne who may have quietly inherited something far less visible. And from one royal enigma to another, we now follow a warrior who led men into battle with a fury unmatched, and whose closest bonds off the field raised more than just banners. 10. Prince Rupert of the Rhine. History remembers Prince Rupert as a cavalry commander, a swashbuckler, and the dashing nephew of King Charles I, a man seemingly born with a sword in one hand and a telescope in the other. But behind the myth of battlefield bravado lies a more complicated portrait. A man whose most intense relationships were not with the women he allegedly courted, but with the officers who served beside him, and sometimes beneath him. Rupert was fiercely loyal to his inner circle. He protected his men beyond reason, promoted them beyond protocol, and grieved them beyond royal decorum. One in particular, an unnamed officer frequently mentioned in dispatches, drew Rupert's concern in ways that went past brotherhood and approached obsession. Their correspondence, though coded in military necessity, often veered into the personal, even the poetic. His eccentricities only fueled the court's unease. Rupert never married. He lived largely in male-dominated spaces, military camps, laboratories, observatories. He was known to be warm, even tender, with his male friends, and prone to dramatic gestures of loyalty. While his masculinity was never doubted, its direction often was. Some said he was simply too focused for romance. Others whispered that he had no interest in women at all. Neither theory stuck, but both lingered. Rupert's legacy is preserved in paintings of battle and discoveries in science, but the emotional terrain he navigated remains murky. His affections, intense, private, fiercely defended, left no heirs but plenty of speculation. And in the shadow of speculation comes a royal courtier not born a prince, but so entangled in scandal and proximity that his name still clings to the gates of Buckingham Palace. 11. Lord Arthur Somerset, royal equerry and grandson of the Duke of Beaufort. Lord Arthur Somerset was the kind of man whose name was meant to echo quietly through country estates and polo matches, not explode in a full-blown scandal involving a brothel, teenage telegraph boys, and enough suppressed testimony to give an archivist a headache. But history has a sense of irony, and Somerset walked right into it, with gloves on and reputation crisp. As an equerry to the future Edward VII, Arthur was well within the royal inner circle, visible, trusted, and positioned at the very hinge of public decorum and private chaos. In 1889, the Cleveland Street scandal broke. A male brothel was discovered in London's West End, frequented by high-ranking men. Very high-ranking. Names began to circulate. One of them, whispered in corridors and printed in coded terms by the press, was Somerset. He was never convicted, never even formally charged. But he was quietly sent abroad. A voluntary exile, they said. A tactical disappearance. The government helped. So did the palace. Anything to protect what they called public morality, and what others suspected was a much more personal list of secrets involving men of title, uniform, and very expensive taste. Somerset's involvement is still debated, but his abrupt flight and the conspicuous silence that followed said more than any trial could. He vanished from the record, but not from the narrative. And the scandal didn't end with him, because there was another name, another royal, who may or may not have crossed the same threshold, and his nickname was Prince Eddie. 12. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, Prince Eddie. Prince Albert Victor was born second in line to the throne, but first in line for scandal. His reputation preceded him, soft-spoken, gentle, distractible, and often described by contemporaries as delicate. Not a word monarchists liked to use. His tutors found him unimpressive. His military commanders found him absent. Society found him fascinating. Rumors trailed him like a badly tailored cape. The most persistent? That he had been somehow involved in the Cleveland Street affair. No hard evidence ever surfaced, and defenders were quick to insist he couldn't possibly have been present. Too busy, too royal, too watched. But his name was whispered anyway, in Parliament, in newspapers, in drawing rooms where discretion was usually the most sacred custom. The gossip wasn't just about sex, it was about softness. Eddie didn't behave like his male relatives. He wasn't commanding or clever or especially ambitious. He preferred music to politics, art to war. His emotional connections, especially with male friends, were described as unusually intense, even romantic in tone. In a family obsessed with image, Eddie was a puzzle with no sharp edges. He died young, at 28 supposedly from influenza. The timing couldn't have been more convenient, for the crown, for the narrative, for the growing list of rumors that no one wanted to fact-check. No heir, no scandal to formally prosecute, just a soft exhale from Buckingham Palace as if the crisis had resolved itself. But if Eddie was gentle to a fault, the man who raised him had once tangled with emotional dependence of his own, and with a male favorite whose name was all too familiar. 13. King Charles I, if James. I was flamboyant in his affections and transparent in his attachments. His son Charles I preferred the slow burn, controlled, formal, and at times, almost unreadable. But even stoicism has its tells, and Charles's youth reveals a portrait of a prince far more emotionally entangled than his later, solemn paintings would suggest. In his early years, Charles was intensely close with George Villiers, the very same Duke of Buckingham who had been his father's controversial favorite. When James died, Charles didn't exile Villiers. He inherited him. Their closeness was immediate, strange, and, to many at court, uncomfortably familiar. Villiers held a strange sway over both father and son, becoming not just a political necessity, but a personal fixture. Charles even allowed Villiers to accompany him on delicate diplomatic missions, sometimes without clear justification. Was it loyalty, convenience, or something a little more human? When Villiers was assassinated in 1628, Charles was devastated. He retreated into grief, withdrew from council, and enshrined his friend's memory with a reverence that seemed out of step with typical political mourning. Theirs may not have been a love story in the romantic sense, but it certainly was one in the emotional sense. Deeply personal, woven into power, and shaped by the strange inheritance of affection passed down from father to son. Charles's reign would end in civil war, trial, and execution. But long before he lost his head, he may have lost something quieter, an emotional tether that had once held him steady in a world that didn't understand softness in men. And then there's Villiers himself. No crown, no lineage, but possibly the most beloved man two kings ever trusted too much. 14. George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham. George Villiers didn't need a crown. He had two kings instead. First, James I, who adored him so blatantly that the entire court stopped pretending to be subtle. Then Charles III, who picked up the emotional thread as if it had never dropped. Villiers was many things: a political climber, a social chameleon, a devastatingly good-looking man with a flair for flattery and power. But more than that, he was the gravitational center of a royal obsession that outlasted one reign and haunted the next. He and James exchanged letters that read less like diplomacy and more like diary entries. "My sweet child and wife," James once wrote to him, signing off as, "your old dad and husband." The court didn't need to read between the lines. They read the lines, out loud, and with side eyes. Villiers knew how to play the part too: affectionate, coy, loyal, and always dressed for the part of royal companion. Under Charles, his role shifted from romantic to dynastic, but the intimacy remained. He held military command, arranged marriages, and influenced policy with a level of access that had very little to do with official titles and everything to do with emotional leverage. Some historians dismiss the romantic angle, chalking it up to flamboyant language and 17th century courtiership. Others lean into the subtext with both elbows. Either way, Villiers occupies a strange royal space, neither consort nor courtier, neither outsider nor heir. He was a man both loved and loathed, whose death triggered both public celebration and private devastation. And if his story is one of blurred boundaries, the next royal makes those boundaries vanish entirely into silk, solitude, and suspicious domesticity. 15. Prince George William of Hanover. Prince George William wasn't scandalous. He was simply off-script. Born into a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines, battles, and ceremonial masculinity, he took one look at the expectations and quietly excused himself. No wars, no politics, no alliances forged over fox hunts or duels. Instead, George William slipped into a world of solitude and silk-lined hobbies. He was described by contemporaries as profoundly effeminate, not as a vague insult but as a clinical observation. His interests leaned domestic, his mannerisms soft, his voice unassertive. While other royals were being shoved into cavalry boots and parliamentary debates, George William was content sketching, reading, and avoiding any activity that involved the public eye. His avoidance of marriage, rare but not unheard of, added fuel to the gossip. So did his apparent lack of interest in women in general, and the peculiar intensity with which he attached himself to certain male attendants and companions. Some of them lived with him. Some of them left mysteriously. None were officially acknowledged. What George William lacked in public scandal, he made up for in quiet suspicion. He was the royal no one quite knew what to do with. Too eccentric to trust, too polite to exile, too gentle to punish. He was tolerated, barely. And then, as if on cue, he faded. No major events, no legacy to manage. Just a vague memory in family trees and a handful of letters that never said enough. But the next king didn't just appear soft. He was accused of being soft by everyone from bishops to barons. And in medieval England, effeminate wasn't just an insult. It was a political accusation. 16. King Henry III. England. Henry III was not the king England had braced for. He wore piety like perfume, thick, fragrant, and undeniably noticeable. He was obsessed with architecture, saintly relics, and long-winded ceremonies. He commissioned art. He cried at Mass. He kept his court full of beautiful objects, emotional speeches, and favorite young men whose influence baffled the old guard. Chroniclers were not kind. They called him effeminate, extravagant, and overly devoted to his male companions. He was too affectionate, too unmilitary, and too generous to men with no obvious political credentials. His devotion to Peter de Roche and later Hugh of Lusignan led to mutterings in Parliament about favoritism, corruption, and foreign influence. But beneath that was something else, a discomfort with how Henry expressed himself, physically, emotionally, and socially. He wept often and openly. He praised the beauty of his friends in public. He adorned his favorite spaces with embroidery and stained glass, and spent more time in monasteries than on battlefields. For a medieval king, it was unsettling behavior, not just unmanly, but suspiciously theatrical. His marriage to Eleanor of Provence produced heirs, but their relationship functioned more as a royal alliance than an emotional partnership. The real intimacy seemed to play out behind closed doors, with his chosen inner circle, all male, all curiously exalted. Was Henry simply devout? Sensitive? Misunderstood? Maybe. Or maybe he was another royal living out of sync with the roles history had carved for him. And if Henry was saintly in silk, the next king was saintly to a fault. A man so detached from worldly ambition that even his enemies questioned whether he truly wanted to rule at all. 17. King Henry VI. If ever there were a monarch who seemed like he had wandered into the wrong story, it was Henry VI. Quiet, pious, fragile, and intellectually removed from the blood-soaked politics of 15th century England, Henry reigned like a man perpetually on the verge of apologizing for his own crown. He wasn't just uninterested in war, he seemed almost allergic to it. While his predecessors cleaved their way into legend, Henry preferred libraries, cathedrals, and long, silent walks through cloisters. Contemporaries described him as timid, passive, and heartbreakingly gentle. He loved prayer. He disliked confrontation. He recoiled from violence. He responded to threats with silence and to betrayal with spiritual reflection. All of this led to frequent comparisons, not to other kings, but to queens, nuns, and holy men. He was called effeminate by his critics, not necessarily in the modern sense of gender, but as a shorthand for everything that was unkingly. He was too inward, too soft-spoken, too dependent on the guidance and sometimes manipulation of his male advisors. There were no open scandals, no known lovers of any gender, just an unspoken discomfort that followed Henry wherever he went, the sense that something about him didn't align with the role he was born to play. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't cruel. He just wasn't there. His mental breakdowns later in life only amplified the sense of spectral monarchy. At times the throne seemed occupied by a shadow, and yet Henry left behind a myth of holy detachment, feminine sanctity, and royal inadequacy. But from one man shrouded in silence, we pivot to another, more present, more peculiar, whose private habits sparked quiet alarm even in the stiff-lipped world of Georgian royalty. 18. Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, brother of George III. Prince William Henry was not a rebel. He didn't storm courts or topple governments. He simply existed, awkwardly, on the fringes of royal life, doing just enough to avoid exile and just little enough to stay beneath most historians' radar. But those who knew him whispered of something strange. Not criminal, not scandalous, just strange. He was eccentric, oddly theatrical. He kept his own routines, held fast to his own peculiar customs, and seemed far more interested in domestic quiet than dynastic ambition. While his brother George III embodied stiff moralism and public duty, William Henry gave off the air of a man rehearsing a private play no one else had been invited to attend. Court gossip noted his close relationships with male servants and valets, especially one who remained with him for decades, prompting eyebrows and late-night whispers from the household staff. His aversion to women wasn't absolute. He did eventually marry, late in life, but even that felt more like royal bookkeeping than affection. The marriage was morganatic, unapproved by the king, and entirely lacking in fanfare. Almost like an afterthought, he surrounded himself with books, oddities, and a rotating cast of quiet companions. There was no scandal in the headlines, just a persistent rumor among those who moved between palace walls that the Duke of Gloucester didn't quite belong. Not in his time, not in his role, not even in his own skin, perhaps. And from one prince cloaked in eccentricity, we turn to another royal known for flamboyance, whose fashion, friendships, and love of spectacle left even his libertine peers squinting sideways. 19. King George IV as Prince Regent. King George IV lived his life like an overfunded opera, flamboyant, indulgent, and suspiciously performative. Before he took the crown, he reigned as Prince Regent, and even then he made monarchy look more like theater than governance. With powdered wigs piled high, silks stitched tighter than scandal, and a collection of rings that could blind a parliament, George wasn't just a royal. He was a curated display of eccentric masculinity. Women, yes, there were many. Mistresses, marriages, and melodrama. But quietly threaded through the sequins and scandals were a few names no one dared put in the papers. Male names, poets, dandies, close companions who received lavish gifts, mysterious titles, and emotional correspondence that read less like diplomacy and more like veiled yearning. His friendship with Sir Charles Carrington, for example, bordered on something more emotionally charged than politics would admit. Letters were private, their relationship was public, and the line between affection and dependence often disappeared in the haze of claret and candlelight. The prince was prone to weeping over Carrington's absences, praising his soul, and slipping into poetic melancholy that wouldn't be out of place in a Regency romance. Was George IV bisexual, or just theatrically sentimental? Historians can't agree. But when a man wears rouge better than his mistresses and commissions portraits that seem to flirt with their own viewer, questions inevitably follow. Still, beneath all the glitter and gossip, there was a child once, quiet, overlooked, and curiously different. And while he never grew into a king, he remains one of the royal family's most puzzling enigmas. 20. Prince John, son of George V. Prince John was the royal who was never meant to be seen, let alone remembered. Born the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, John lived most of his short life behind the high walls of Sandringham, shrouded in euphemism and medical concern. Officially, he suffered from epilepsy and learning disabilities. Unofficially, he was quietly written out of public life before he'd even turned 10. What makes Prince John's story linger isn't what's said, but what isn't. In family photos, he vanishes. In official records, he's barely there. But personal accounts from household staff, tutors, and rare visitors paint a picture of a gentle, affectionate child, sensitive, joyful, and strangely otherworldly. He adored animals. He loved flowers. He had no interest in guns or horses or anything resembling traditional masculine grooming. Contemporary descriptions of John, both during and after his life, often use coded language, delicate, angelic, not quite like the others. Some historians now interpret this not just as a reflection of disability, but as gender nonconformity. He gravitated toward domestic play, soft fabric. 21. King Edward VII, as Prince Albert Edward. King Edward VII, long before the crown settled on his head, had already established himself as Europe's most devoted pleasure seeker. Women fell over him, courtiers bowed to him, tailors wept tears of joy at his endless appetite for fabric and form. He was a symbol of indulgence, excess, and overwhelming heterosexual display, or so the legend insists. But behind the cigars and the satin was a softer subtext, one that clung to his deepest friendships and lingered just out of polite reach. His relationship with Sir Charles Carrington, a name that appears more than once in Edwardian footnotes, was more than courtly camaraderie. The two were inseparable for years. Their correspondence personal, affectionate, and increasingly laced with emotional dependency. Carrington wasn't just a friend, he was a confidant, an emotional anchor, and to many observers, the man who saw the real Edward beneath the velvet and volume. Though Edward VII would go on to be remembered for his string of mistresses, his closeness with men like Carrington raises old questions. What was hidden in plain sight? Why did so many of his male friendships seem so urgent? Why did he retreat into moments of melancholy when those men drifted away? Perhaps Edward's flamboyant womanizing was its own kind of misdirection, a distraction so loud no one would notice the quieter bonds forming in its shadow. Whatever the truth, the emotional 22. Charles II, as a young man. Before Charles II returned to England on a wave of Restoration euphoria, before the mistresses and the theater scandals and the cynical charm, there was a very different Charles, an exile, a teenager, and a royal boy coming of age in the soft shadows of European courts. It was there, in the refined salons of Catholic nobility and the dim-lit quarters of loyalist exiles, that Charles learned the art of ambiguity. Contemporaries who knew him as a youth often described him in surprisingly delicate terms. Not yet the swaggering libertine of later years, young Charles was known for his unusually refined taste, his introspective demeanor, and a wardrobe that raised a few eyebrows. His time abroad, particularly in France, put him in close contact with courtiers and companions who were theatrical, emotional, and often more expressive than English standards allowed. It rubbed off. He grew close with a circle of male attendants whose names rarely appear in official histories, but whose presence was consistent and curiously intimate. There are letters, lost, half-burned, and rumored to exist, that suggest emotional dependencies, if not more. And long before the Restoration turned Charles into a caricature of heterosexual chaos, there were murmurs among his detractors that the prince had once preferred silks and sentimentality over swords and statecraft. Did those early years shape the king he became? Or were they simply a phase of soft 23? Prince Alexander of Battenberg. Prince Alexander of Battenberg had the misfortune of being born into a family that never quite knew what to do with him. He was royal adjacent, a grandson of Queen Victoria through her daughter, but foreign enough, Bulgaria no less, to make things complicated. A soldier, a statesman, and briefly a prince in his own right, Alexander was poised for greatness. But the rumors always walked a few steps ahead of him. He was called effeminate by more than one observer, not for any scandalous behavior, but for his manner, graceful, overly polished, even theatrical. In the world of 19th century royalty, where masculinity was measured in cavalry charges and steely reserve, Alexander's elegance was, frankly, suspicious. His relationships with male equerries and aides were intense, long-lasting, and oddly personal for someone trained in the stiff rituals of dynastic diplomacy. One in particular, a Hungarian aide-de-camp, was noted for being constantly at his side, both in public and private, prompting years of low-volume palace chatter. Biographers dance carefully around the subject, but they note a pattern: emotional reliance, extravagant gift-giving, and the strange, quiet comfort that seemed to pass between them. Was it love? Was it loneliness? Was it something else entirely? The mystery isn't in what's recorded. It's 24. King James II, Duke of York. James II is remembered mostly for what he believed: Catholicism, absolutism, divine right, and for what it cost him: the throne. But long before he became England's last Catholic king, James was simply the Duke of York, a younger son navigating power and courtly politics under the long shadow of his brother, Charles II. And beneath the armor of ideology was a man whose personal temperament baffled almost everyone. While not directly linked to any male relationships, James's youth was described by his contemporaries as curiously feminine. Not in appearance, he was physically unremarkable, but in behavior, emotional, theatrical, thin-skinned, and deeply attached to a small circle of male friends and attendants. He cried easily. He clung to spiritual advisors and private confidants with an intensity more associated with romantic devotion than political strategy. Some members of court accused him of being too soft for rule, too prone to emotional outbursts and obsessive loyalty. He had no taste for casual brutality, no talent for charming his way through scandal. He was, in short, an awkward fit for the Restoration Court's performative masculinity. Despite marrying, twice, and fathering a number of children, including the future Old Pretender, James carried himself with a kind of inward fragility that disturbed his peers. He was devout, reserved, 25. Prince Philip, rumor only. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, lived his public life like a man trying to outrun a script someone else had written. He was cast as the stoic consort, the royal alpha, the man who gave up everything: his name, his naval career, his independence, to walk 2 paces behind a crown he would never wear. He played the part with dry wit and military posture. But even in a life so carefully choreographed, the rumor mill found its opening. Some tabloids in the mid-20th century began whispering about Philip's male friendships, specifically a few companions during his Royal Navy years and early post-war period. One name, often repeated without much evidence, was that of a handsome society figure who appeared in the prince's social circle for a time in the 1940s. They traveled together, laughed too freely, and looked too comfortable in each other's company. Nothing was confirmed, no sources credible, but the rumor stuck like lipstick on a collar, mostly invisible but never fully removed. What fuels these kinds of rumors isn't always fact, it's contrast. The same Philip known for making pointedly macho quips also had a love of poetry. The same man who lectured young royals on duty also surrounded himself with artists, actors, and philosophers. He moved through elite male-dominated spaces with ease, but kept his emotions firmly locked away. That mix, rigid masculinity and private tenderness, was enough to trigger 1,000 whispered theories. Officially, there's nothing. Unofficially, there's just enough silence to be suspicious. And so we end not with proof, but with possibility. A long parade of royals who blurred, dodged, or quietly dismantled the strict binaries history tried to impose on them.